They never wrote his name down anywhere. Not in the plantation records. Not in the family Bible. Not even on the wooden crosses that marked the graves behind the fields. To them, he was simply called the man. But long before the truth came out, before whispers turned into gasps and gasps into silence, he was the one who held the master's children when they cried at night. He was the one who taught them how to walk, how to pray, how to survive in a world built on cruelty and lies. And he was the one who carried a secret so heavy that when it finally surfaced, it shattered everything the plantation owner thought he knew about himself. This is not a story that begins with kindness. It begins with power, and with a decision so cold, so calculated, that no one on the plantation dared question it. In the early 1800s, the Carter plantation stretched across hundreds of acres of fertile land. Cotton fields rolled endlessly under the southern sun, worked from dawn until darkness by enslaved men and women whose lives were measured in harvests, not years. At the center of it all stood the Carter estate house, white columns, wide porches, and a silence inside that never truly rested. The owner, Thomas Carter, was known as a practical man. Not cruel by reputation, but not kind either. He believed emotions were weaknesses, and sentiment had no place in running land, labor, or family. His wife, Eleanor, had died giving birth to their third child, leaving behind 2 sons and a newborn daughter. From the day Eleanor was buried, Thomas made a decision that would haunt every life connected to his. He would not raise his children himself, and he would not hire help from town. Instead, he chose a slave. His name was Samuel. Samuel was in his early 20s, strong-backed, quiet-spoken, and recently separated from his own family after being sold to the Carter plantation. He had lost a wife, a child he never met. Loss clung to him like dust in the fields, invisible but ever-present. Thomas noticed Samuel not for his grief, but for his steadiness. When the baby cried, Samuel didn't flinch. When others avoided the house, Samuel obeyed. When Thomas needed someone who would not question orders, Samuel stood silent. One evening, just days after Eleanor's funeral, Thomas summoned Samuel to the main house. No explanation. No warning. Samuel stood stiffly in the parlor, hat clutched in his hands, eyes lowered as he had been taught. Thomas didn't offer a seat. He didn't offer condolences. He didn't even use Samuel's name at first. "You'll be working inside now," Thomas said flatly. Samuel nodded once. "You'll tend to the children. Feed them. Watch them. Sleep nearby." Samuel hesitated, not from defiance, but from confusion. "Sir, the children?" Thomas's eyes hardened. "My children need care. You'll provide it." That was the moment. The moment a line was crossed that could never be uncrossed. From that night on, Samuel's world changed completely. He was moved into a small room near the nursery. He learned the routines of infants and toddlers instead of field schedules. He memorized lullabies whispered by a woman who would never sing them again. He cleaned scraped knees, dried tears, and held nightmares at bay, always under watchful eyes, always knowing that affection was dangerous. The children grew attached quickly. Too quickly. They called for Samuel before they called for their father. They reached for him when they were frightened. They trusted him with a kind of innocent faith that only children possess, unaware of the rules, the punishments, the walls separating their lives from his. Thomas noticed. At first, he ignored it. Then, he began to resent it. But still, he allowed it to continue. Because Samuel was useful. Because Samuel was quiet. Because Samuel never asked why. Years passed. The children grew. The plantation thrived. And Samuel became something that had no name, a father without rights, a caretaker without recognition, a man forced to pour love into children he could never claim. At night, after the children slept, Samuel would sit alone and think of the child taken from him. He wondered if someone else was raising his son the way he was raising another man's children. He wondered if love could survive when it was forbidden. And deep inside him, buried beneath obedience and fear, lived a truth that no one, not even Samuel himself, was fully ready to face. Because this arrangement, This decision Thomas Carter made in grief was not as simple as it seemed. And years later, when the past finally demanded its voice, the truth would come out, bringing with it consequences no one on the plantation could escape. Samuel learned quickly that love, when forbidden, becomes a dangerous thing. At first, his care for the children was purely practical. Feed them, wash them, keep them quiet when their father worked late into the night. But children have a way of pulling truth out of people, even when that truth is buried under fear. They reached for him without thinking. They smiled at him without knowing it was wrong. And Samuel, despite every warning he gave himself, responded. The youngest, little Clara, clung to him most. She had been only days old when her mother died, and Samuel was the first steady presence she ever knew. When she cried, it was Samuel who calmed her. When she learned to walk, it was Samuel's hands she trusted to catch her if she fell. The boys, William and Henry, followed him everywhere. They asked him questions Thomas never answered. Why the sky changed colors at sunset? Why the workers sang while they labored? Why some people slept in cabins while others slept in the big house? Samuel answered carefully. Always carefully. He knew the danger of saying too much. Yet even restraint could not stop attachment from forming. By the time Clara was 5, she called Samuel Papa by accident one afternoon while chasing fireflies in the yard. The words slipped out without thought, light as breath. The world seemed to freeze. Samuel's heart nearly stopped. He glanced around, terrified someone had heard. But the yard was empty. Just him and the children, laughter still hanging in the air. Clara smiled, unaware of what she'd done. Papa, she repeated, proud of herself. Samuel knelt in front of her, hands shaking. He gently corrected her, voice barely steady. No, baby. You mustn't say that. Her smile faded. But you take care of us, she said. You always come when we cry. Samuel swallowed hard. Some truths hurt more when spoken by a child. From that day on, Samuel tried to pull back. He became quieter, more distant. He kept his hands busy and his emotions locked away. But children feel absence as deeply as presence, and they noticed. William confronted him one evening as Samuel tucked them into bed. Did we do something wrong? The boy asked. Samuel paused, heart aching. No, he said softly. Never that. Then why don't you smile anymore? Samuel had no answer. Meanwhile, Thomas Carter watched all of this from a distance. He saw how the children leaned toward Samuel instinctively. He noticed how they barely reacted when he entered the room, but lit up when Samuel did. At first, it stung his pride. Then it unsettled him. And finally, it angered him. Thomas had never planned to love his children deeply. He believed affection weakened authority. Still, he expected loyalty, obedience, recognition. And Samuel was taking that from him, without meaning to, without asking. One night, Thomas called Samuel into his study. The room smelled of ink and leather. Papers lay stacked on the desk, plantation ledgers filled with numbers and names. Thomas did not invite Samuel to sit. You're forgetting your place, Thomas said. Samuel lowered his head. I don't understand, sir. My children, Thomas continued, voice cold. They look to you as if you are something more than you are. Samuel's chest tightened. I never encouraged it, he said carefully. I do only what you asked. Thomas stepped closer. You will remember, he said, that they are not yours. And they never will be. The words landed like a blow. Samuel nodded once. Yes, sir. From then on, Thomas placed restrictions on Samuel's time with the children. He assigned other slaves to assist during the day, pushing Samuel into the background. But when night came, when fear and illness and loneliness crept in, it was always Samuel they called for. And Thomas let it happen. Because despite his resentment, he needed Samuel. The plantation ran smoothly, but the house felt hollow. Samuel filled that emptiness in ways Thomas never could. And deep down, Thomas knew it. Years continued to pass. Samuel aged quietly, lines forming around his eyes, his strength slowly worn by emotional weight rather than labor. The children grew taller, smarter, more aware of the world around them. And, with awareness came questions. William began to notice the differences. Why Samuel ate in the kitchen. Why he slept in a smaller room. Why people bowed to their father but looked at Samuel with something closer to fear. One afternoon, William asked the question Samuel had dreaded. "Why don't you have a family?" the boy asked. Samuel froze. "I did," he said slowly. "Once." "What happened to them?" Samuel hesitated, then answered truthfully but not completely. "They were taken from me." The boy frowned. "That's not fair." Samuel almost laughed at the simplicity of it. "No," he said. "It isn't." That night, Samuel lay awake, staring at the ceiling, haunted by memories he had long tried to bury. He thought of his wife's face, of the child he never held, and of the children sleeping just down the hall, children who loved him, children he loved, children who were never meant to be his. What Samuel did not yet know was that the truth tying him to those children ran deeper than anyone imagined, and that the past Thomas Carter believed he had buried was already beginning to surface. By the time William turned 15, the plantation no longer felt like a simple world divided into orders and obedience. He had begun to see cracks. Not all at once, not loudly, but in quiet moments, moments when truth has a way of slipping through before anyone can stop it. William noticed how Samuel aged faster than other men, how the lines in his face were deeper, carved by worry rather than time. He noticed how Samuel stood straighter when the children entered the room, even now that they were nearly grown. And he noticed something else too, something that unsettled him in ways he couldn't explain. When he looked in the mirror, he looked like Samuel. Not exactly, but enough to raise questions. They shared the same dark eyes, the same curve of the jaw, the same quiet expression when thinking deeply. William dismissed it at first, telling himself resemblance meant nothing. But as the years passed, the similarities grew harder to ignore. Henry noticed it too. One afternoon, while walking back from the fields, Henry spoke what William had been thinking. "Have you ever noticed," Henry said slowly, "how we look more like him than father?" William stopped walking. "Don't say that," he muttered. "But it's true," Henry insisted. "Father's hair is lighter. His eyes too. And Clara, she's the same." William felt his stomach twist. "People would hear you," he warned. Henry shrugged, uneasy. "I'm just saying." The thought followed them like a shadow. At the same time, Samuel felt a shift he couldn't explain. The children, no, the young adults now, watched him differently. Their questions were sharper. Their silences heavier. Samuel sensed the danger long before it arrived. One evening, Clara approached him in the garden as the sun dipped low. "Samuel," she said, hesitating before using his name. "Can I ask you something?" Samuel's heart sank. "Of course," he replied gently. "Did my mother ever talk about us?" she asked. About how we would grow up?" Samuel paused. "She loved you very much," he said carefully. "But did she trust father?" Clara pressed. The question struck deeper than Samuel expected. "She trusted that you would be cared for," he answered. Clara studied him closely. "She trusted you," she said. It wasn't a question. Samuel looked away. Inside the house, Thomas Carter grew, increasingly uneasy. He felt it in the way his children spoke less to him and more around him. He felt it in the way Samuel's presence still anchored the household, even after Thomas tried to diminish it. But what unsettled Thomas most were his own memories. Memories he had buried deep. Eleanor's final years had been difficult. She had grown distant, ill, and withdrawn. Thomas had been away often, tending business, managing land, expanding his holdings. He had trusted his household to run itself. And Samuel had been there. Always there. The thought crept into Thomas's mind late one night as he sat alone with a glass of whiskey. He pushed it away immediately. Impossible, he told himself. Unthinkable. And yet doubt has a way of growing once planted. Thomas began watching more closely. He compared faces. He recalled timelines. He revisited moments he had ignored years ago, moments that now felt weighted with meaning. Samuel had been assigned to the house shortly before Eleanor's pregnancy with Clara. Samuel had stayed close during Eleanor's illness. Samuel had been trusted. The realization made Thomas physically ill. He summoned Samuel again. This time his voice shook. "Did you ever touch my wife?" Thomas demanded. The question hung in the air like poison. Samuel froze, stunned. "No," he said firmly. "Never." Thomas searched his face, desperate for certainty. "You swear it." "I swear on everything I have lost," Samuel replied. Thomas stepped back, breathing hard. The answer should have brought relief. It didn't, because the truth Thomas feared was not only about betrayal, it was about guilt, about power abused, about a woman who had no choice. Meanwhile, the children's suspicions grew into whispered conversations behind closed doors. One night, William confronted Samuel directly. "Why did you stay?" he asked quietly. "Why us?" Samuel looked at him for a long moment. "Because you needed someone," he said. "And because you loved us," William said. Samuel's voice broke. "Yes." The word slipped out before he could stop it. And in that moment, William understood something he could not yet name, but would never forget. The plantation stood still that night, unaware that the truth, long buried, long denied, was pressing against the surface. Waiting. Secrets do not stay buried forever. They wait. They grow heavier with time, pressing down on everyone who carries them until the weight becomes unbearable. For Samuel, that weight had been building for decades. And now, with the children grown and Thomas watching him with suspicion instead of authority, the truth hovered dangerously close to the surface. It was Clara who forced it out. She had always been the quietest of the three, the most observant. Where her brothers questioned aloud, Clara listened. She remembered things others dismissed. Small details, glances, silences. One evening, she found Samuel alone in the old storage shed behind the house, repairing a broken chair. The sun filtered through the wooden slats, casting long shadows across the floor. "Samuel," she said softly, "I need you to tell me something." Samuel didn't look up. "Ask," he replied. "Did my mother choose you?" The question stopped his hands. Slowly, he set the chair aside and stood. "That's not a question you should be asking," he said. "But I am," Clara insisted. "Because nothing else makes sense." Samuel closed his eyes. He had practiced this moment in his mind countless times, what he would say if the truth ever demanded to be spoken. But no version had prepared him for the pain in her voice. "She didn't have choices," Samuel said at last. Clara swallowed hard. "But you were there," she whispered. "Weren't you?" Samuel nodded. And in that nod, the past broke open. He told her everything. About Eleanor's loneliness. About Thomas's absences. About the nights Eleanor cried. About the comfort she sought in someone who listened. He told her about the power imbalance. About fear. About guilt. And finally, he told her the part he had never spoken aloud. "I believe," Samuel said, voice shaking, "that I am your father." The shed felt suddenly too small. Clara staggered back, tears spilling down her face, not from shock alone, but from recognition, from understanding, from a lifetime of love suddenly given a name. She didn't scream. She didn't accuse. She stepped forward and hugged him. Samuel broke down in her arms. The secret was no longer his alone. The next day, Clara told her brothers. Henry reacted with anger. William with silence. Neither knew how to hold the truth without it cutting them. They confronted Thomas together that evening. Thomas listened without interruption. When they finished, he poured himself another drink. "I knew," he said quietly. The room went still. "I suspected for years," Thomas continued. "But I chose not to know." Samuel was summoned one final time. This time, there were no orders, no threats, only a man facing the consequences of his past. Thomas did not shout. He asked one question. "Did you love her?" Samuel nodded. "Yes." Thomas closed his eyes. In that moment, the power dynamic shifted forever. The plantation owner who had once controlled every life around him now faced the truth that control had cost him everything that mattered. After the truth came out, nothing on the plantation sounded the same. Footsteps echoed louder. Doors closed more slowly. Even the wind moving through the cotton fields seemed to hesitate, as if the land itself sensed that something fundamental had broken. Thomas Carter did not punish Samuel. That alone stunned everyone. No chains. No whipping post. No sudden disappearance in the night. Instead, Thomas retreated into silence. He stopped issuing orders directly. He avoided the children. And for the first time in his life, he appeared unsure. The man who once ruled by certainty had none left. For Samuel, the days after the confession were the most difficult of his life. The truth had freed him, but it had also stripped away the fragile structure that had kept him alive. He no longer knew where he stood. He no longer knew what role he was allowed to play. Father, slave, caretaker, liability. The plantation had no language for what he was now. William sought him out first. He found Samuel sitting alone near the tree where the children had once played, carving a small piece of wood absent-mindedly. "You didn't lie to us," William said. Samuel looked up, surprised. "I lied by staying silent," he replied. William shook his head. "You protected us." Those words hit Samuel harder than any punishment ever could. Henry came later. His anger had cooled, replaced by confusion and grief. "I don't know how to forgive Father," Henry admitted, "but I know I don't want to lose you." Samuel said nothing. He only nodded. Clara never left Samuel's side. She brought him food herself, sat with him in the evenings, asked him questions about his life before the plantation, questions no one had ever cared to ask. And Thomas watched all of it. One night, Thomas finally spoke. He asked Samuel to meet him on the porch after the house had gone quiet. No witnesses. No authority. Just two men facing what remained of their choices. "I built this place believing control was the same as order," Thomas said, staring out into the darkness. "I was wrong." Samuel listened. "I thought giving you responsibility over my children would solve a problem," Thomas continued. "Instead, it revealed one." Samuel waited. "I took everything from you," Thomas said quietly. "And I taught my children to love you anyway." The words were not an apology, but they were the closest Thomas Carter had ever come. Thomas made a decision the following week, one that shocked the plantation. Samuel was freed. Not quietly, not conditionally, legally. Papers were drawn. Witnesses gathered. The announcement spread through the fields like fire. A man who had been owned for decades walked away from bondage carrying nothing but his name and the weight of a lifetime. Freedom did not feel like celebration. It felt like standing at the edge of a cliff, unsure how to move forward. Samuel remained near the plantation, not because he had to, but because his children were there. The world beyond was dangerous, unkind, and uncertain. And love, even complicated love, pulled him back. The plantation itself began to change. Thomas withdrew from management. William took on more responsibility. Henry oversaw the fields with fairness instead of fear. Clara learned the ledgers, learned the truth of what the land had cost. The enslaved workers noticed. Rules softened. Punishments lessened. Conversations began where silence once ruled. Not freedom, but movement. And that movement terrified Thomas more than rebellion ever had. One evening, Thomas collapsed in his study. Illness took him quickly. As he lay dying, he asked for Samuel. "I don't ask forgiveness," Thomas said weakly. "I don't deserve it." Samuel stood at the foot of the bed. "I ask only this," Thomas continued. "Make sure they become better than I was." Samuel nodded. "I already am," he replied. Thomas died that night. And with him died the version of the plantation that had existed for generations. But the story did not end with his death. Because the truth, once spoken, does not simply fade. It demands reckoning. Thomas Carter's funeral was quiet. There were no grand speeches, no overflowing crowds. Just a small gathering beneath the old oak trees near the edge of the property. The kind of burial that suggested a man who had owned much, but been known by few. Samuel stood apart from the others. Not out of disrespect, out of habit. Even now, free by law, acknowledged by truth, he still carried the reflex of distance. Years of knowing where not to stand do not vanish overnight. William noticed. He stepped away from the family cluster and stood beside Samuel. "You don't have to stay back anymore," William said. Samuel smiled faintly. "I know, but knowing and believing were different things." As dirt fell onto the coffin, Samuel felt something unexpected rise in his chest. Not grief for the man himself, but for what could have been different. For the lives shaped by silence. For the damage done by choosing power over honesty. When it was over, people drifted away in small groups. Conversations stayed hushed. No one quite knew how to speak yet, not about Thomas, not about Samuel, not about the future of the plantation. That future arrived faster than anyone expected. Within weeks, William officially assumed ownership of the land. He did so reluctantly, aware of the weight he inherited, not just acres and accounts, but history. He called the workers together, standing where his father once had. But he did not speak like Thomas Carter. He spoke plainly. "There will be changes," William said. "Some immediately, some over time. But no one here will be treated as invisible again." The word landed hard. Invisible. Samuel felt it like a hand on his back. William turned toward him then, publicly, deliberately. "This man raised us," he said. "Not as property. As people." The field was silent. "He is not our secret," William continued. "He is our father." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Samuel's knees nearly buckled. In all his life, no word had ever frightened him more than that one, father. Because speaking it meant claiming something the world had always told him he could not have. But William said it anyway. Henry stepped forward next. "We won't pretend this land is clean," he said. "But we will not lie about who we are." Clara reached for Samuel's hand. She didn't ask. She simply took it. And for the first time, Samuel stood openly beside his children. Not in shadow, not in silence. Not owned. Named. Life did not suddenly become easy. Freedom was complicated. Some workers left. Others stayed, unsure of what the future held. Samuel struggled, most of all. For years, his identity had been shaped by service and survival. Now he had to decide who he was without either. He chose to stay. Not as a servant. As family. He moved into a small house near the edge of the property. Not the big house, never that, but a place that was his. Clara helped furnish it. Henry repaired the roof. William insisted Samuel sign documents he could barely read, ensuring his ownership was legal, unquestionable. Samuel learned slowly. He learned how to rest without guilt, how to speak without permission, how to sit in silence that did not mean danger. Sometimes, at night, he still woke up afraid. Old habits died hard. But then he would hear laughter, his grandchildren playing in the distance, and he would remember that the world had changed. Because of truth. Because of courage. Because someone had finally spoken his name. Samuel. Not the man. Not the slave. Not the secret. Just Samuel. And that name, spoken openly at last, became the foundation for everything that followed. Time passed differently on the plantation once Samuel's name was spoken. The fields continued to stretch under the southern sun, and the cotton plants still swayed with the wind, but everything else had changed. Walls that had once held secrets were now invisible. Shadows that had been heavy with fear lifted slowly, replaced with the uncertain light of honesty. Samuel's relationship with his children deepened. William and Henry, now young men tasked with managing the land, consulted him not just out of necessity, but out of respect. They no longer saw him as merely the caretaker who had raised them. They saw him as their father, their guide, the man who had protected their lives in ways their own father never could. Clara became his constant companion, a bridge between the past and future. She asked questions he had never been able to answer before, questions about his childhood, his family, his own lost dreams. Samuel shared stories he had buried deep inside, tales of love, loss, and survival. And in turn, Clara told him her dreams, her fears, her ambitions, giving him the joy of witnessing their family grow in ways he had never imagined. The workers on the plantation also noticed the change. Samuel no longer worked under the lash of authority. He moved among them as a respected elder, a man whose story carried lessons of resilience, courage, and quiet dignity. Conversations became more open. Laughter returned to corners of the plantation that had once been silent with fear. And while freedom for many was still distant, the recognition of Samuel's humanity set a precedent, a small but profound shift in how the plantation operated. Yet, even as the world around him changed, Samuel carried the weight of the past. He remembered every cry in the nursery. Every night, he slept alone while his children were guarded by duty rather than affection. He remembered the faces of those he had lost and the family he had been denied. That pain never fully went away, but it no longer controlled him. Now, it became a source of strength, a reminder of what he had endured and what he had survived. Samuel also began to reflect on the choices Thomas Carter had made, both cruel and unwittingly consequential. There was anger, of course, anger for the years lost, for the life denied. But there was also understanding. He realized that Thomas, in his rigid sense of control and misguided notions of duty, had acted without fully understanding the human cost. It did not excuse the past, but it provided context, and in that context, Samuel found a measure of peace. Over the next few years, Samuel's legacy became intertwined with the plantation itself. He taught the children to read and write, to question and to learn. He shared stories of the world beyond the fields, of cities and people and places that seemed like dreams to those who had never left the plantation. And he encouraged his children to think beyond the life that had been dictated for them, to imagine futures unbound by the mistakes of their forebears. The small house Samuel now called home became a place of gathering. Neighbors came, workers visited, grandchildren laughed and played in the yard. The house, simple and humble, became a symbol of resilience and hope. A place where the past was acknowledged, not ignored. A place where secrets no longer ruled lives in silence. Samuel, once hidden in shadows, now stood at the center of life, fully seen, fully respected, fully loved. And yet, the secret that had once defined his existence, the one that could have destroyed him, had now transformed into a foundation for everything that followed. It reminded everyone that the truth, no matter how long suppressed, has the power to change lives. That courage, even when exercised quietly, can reshape a family. That love, even when forbidden or unrecognized, can endure through decades of hardship. Samuel never forgot the lesson he had learned in the dark years of the plantation, the years when he was forced to raise children that were not his, while mourning those that were. He knew that the story of his life was not just about survival or endurance. It was about the reclamation of identity, about the courage to claim what was rightfully his, about the power of naming, recognizing, and honoring the truth. In those final years of Samuel's life, the plantation became more than land or legacy. It became a testament to the endurance of the human spirit. Every field, every room, every tree bore witness to the choices, sacrifices, and courage that had transformed despair into hope. And for Samuel, there was satisfaction in knowing that, though he had begun life as the man in the shadows, he had ended it as a father, a teacher, and a symbol of the power of truth. Years had passed since the truth first emerged. The plantation was no longer the rigid, silent place it had once been. Life had found a new rhythm, a rhythm shaped not by fear, but by honesty, love, and respect. Samuel had walked through shadows, borne burdens few could imagine, and now, at last, he stood in the light. The children he had raised, the very children who had unknowingly carried his secret in their resemblance and their curiosity, had grown into adults shaped by both the past and the lessons he had imparted. William had become a fair and thoughtful landowner, determined to manage the estate with justice rather than fear. Henry, once impulsive and restless, had matured into a man who valued loyalty and truth over appearances. Clara, ever observant, had become the heart of the family, reminding everyone that love and courage could flourish even in the harshest of soils. For Samuel, every day was a reminder of how fragile and precious life could be. Every smile, every word, every laugh of the children he had nurtured now belonged to him, not as a slave, not as a secret, but as a father. And yet, the shadow of the past lingered, etched into his memory like the grooves of the cotton fields he had once tended, not with hands of labor, but with hands of love. The plantation itself had become a place of testimony. Workers no longer saw Samuel as a figure of obedience alone. They saw him as a man whose life had endured injustice, yet remained unbroken. Conversations once forbidden now happened openly. Stories of hardship were told and heard, and Samuel became a living reminder that survival was possible and dignity could be reclaimed. The secret that had once endangered him had now transformed into a beacon of resilience. But the final proof of that transformation came not in words, but in gestures. One afternoon, as Samuel sat on the porch overlooking the fields, he watched his grandchildren play. The sun glinted off the cotton, bright against the deep green of the trees, and the laughter carried freely across the estate. He remembered the nights he had spent in silence, holding children he could not claim, teaching lessons he would never see recognized. He thought of Thomas Carter, the man who had unknowingly set the chain of events into motion, and he thought of Eleanor, whose absence had created both sorrow and opportunity. And he smiled, not out of triumph, but out of peace. William approached him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You've given us more than anyone else could," he said quietly. "You've given us life and the truth." Samuel nodded. "And you've given me recognition," he replied. "Not just freedom, but a place in the world I never thought I could have." That recognition was more than legal, more than social. It was spiritual. It was the reclamation of a life denied, the fulfillment of a role he had played, without consent but with devotion. He had been forced to raise children as a slave, and yet, in doing so, he had nurtured a legacy that would endure long after he was gone. Even the land seemed to honor the change. Trees once trimmed with precision now grew freely. Flowers once hidden in shadow bloomed near the main house. The cotton fields, though still a place of labor, shimmered with a new life, one where history had been acknowledged and where honesty had become a guide rather than a punishment. Samuel's story spread beyond the plantation as well. Neighbors, travelers, and workers carried the tale of the man who had raised another man's children, who had survived bondage, and who had been finally recognized for his courage. It became a story whispered in the South for generations, a cautionary tale about power, secrecy, and the consequences of choices made in fear or pride. But it also became a story of hope, a story that even in a world built on injustice, truth could find a way to shine. In his final years, Samuel taught his grandchildren not just the skills of the land, but the lessons of life. He spoke of honesty, of love, of sacrifice, and of resilience. He reminded them that secrets, if carried too long, could crush the spirit, but that courage in speaking the truth could transform lives. And he reminded them, quietly but insistently, that family was not just defined by blood or law, but by care, devotion, and recognition. When Samuel passed, it was not quietly. It was not unremarkably. The plantation paused. Children, grandchildren, workers, neighbors, all stood together to honor a life that had survived impossible odds. His name, finally spoken for decades without fear, was carried on lips that would never forget. Samuel, father, protector, witness to a truth that had long been hidden, but had now shaped generations. The Carter plantation would never be the same. And in that transformation lay the enduring power of the story, that love, truth, and courage could survive even the most unimaginable oppression. That a life once hidden in shadows could illuminate the path for all who came after. And that a secret, finally revealed, could not destroy, but rather could redeem. For decades, people would tell the story of Samuel, the man forced to raise another's children, the secret he carried, and the truth that finally came out. And in telling it, they honored the courage of a man who lived his life quietly, nobly, and fully, even when the world tried to deny him everything. Because sometimes the greatest truths are the ones that no one dares to speak. And when they are spoken, they can change everything.